The provincial land registry valued the old fishing lodge at nothing. Not low nothing. 42 acres of Canadian shield rock on the eastern shore of Lac Brûlé, a collapsing two-story building with a rusted tin roof, and a boathouse so rotted through that the dock boards had given up and dropped themselves into the lake. The assessor's office in Rouen-Noranda had written the structures off entirely. 42 acres of granite and black spruce, valued at $830, and even that felt generous. It was the only thing in the divorce that her husband's lawyer didn't fight for. So at 53, with $11,000 in a savings account she'd been quietly building for 2 years, without telling anyone why. A 12-year-old Subaru, with a crack in the windshield that the cold kept widening, and a rented room in a friend's basement in Sudbury that she'd promised herself was temporary. Nora Veilleux drove 4 hours north into the Abitibi to look at what she'd been left. She meant to spend one night and be back on the highway by noon the next day. That was 3 weeks ago, and what she found inside that lodge, not the money, not the antiques, not anything you could carry out in a box, is the reason an entire community along Lac Brûlé still talks about a man most of them only knew by his first name. Before we go any further, take a second to hit subscribe and tap the like button, because what Nora discovered in that building is the kind of story that changes the way you see what a life is actually worth. And tell us in the comments where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's begin. The lawyer's office smelled like recycled air and burnt coffee, the particular smell of a room where people finish things. Nora had driven 2 hours from Sudbury in the November dark, leaving before sunrise so she wouldn't have to think too hard about what she was driving toward. The receptionist had offered her a coffee from a machine in the corner, and she'd taken it and held it without drinking, because it gave her hands something to do. Philippe wasn't there. He'd sent his associate instead, a composed young woman named Arsenault, who had the careful stillness of someone trained to deliver bad news without letting it land on her personally. She set a folder on the table between them and opened it to a page flagged in yellow. "He's asked me to convey that he hopes the process is as straightforward as possible," Arsenault said. Nora looked at the yellow tab. 22 years, she thought. 22 years in a house that is now not hers, with a man who hopes the process is straightforward. She initialed where the tabs told her to. The asset schedule was read aloud in a voice Arsenault used the way a pharmacist reads dosage instructions. Accurate, entirely without effect. The house on Cartier Street, the pension she'd signed away in exchange for keeping her car and not fighting over the furniture, the joint account. The RRSP. All of it, under the terms she'd agreed to. In a moment of exhaustion she could not now take back, staying with Philippe. Then Arsenault tapped a single line near the bottom of the last page and almost moved on. "This one transfers to you," she said. "Real property, Lac Brûlé, Abitibi-Témiscamingue, a fishing lodge." She glanced up briefly. "There are outstanding municipal taxes. You'll want to address those. What's it worth?" Nora asked. Arsenault almost smiled. "The municipality has the structures assessed at replacement cost of $0. The land itself, $830. She set the page down. Monsieur Veilleux's position was that pursuing it wasn't worth the legal cost. That was the kindest thing said about her in that room. And it wasn't meant kindly. The lodge was hers because no one could think of a reason to want it. Nora picked up the box she'd set beside her chair. Philippe had left it on the front step, inside. A ceramic bowl she'd bought at a market in Montreal the year they were engaged. A photograph of her father in his fishing hat, standing on a dock she recognized. A watch with a dead battery she'd stopped wearing years ago. 22 years, and it fit in a box she could carry under one arm. She drove north. The city thinned and then quit entirely, and the highway became a regional road, which became a county road, which became something that was less a road than a memory of one. The Laurentian shield pushed up through the soil in great gray shelves of granite, and the birch and black spruce grew dense and indifferent to everything happening below. Nora cracked her window an inch. The air smelled like cold water and pine resin and something older underneath, the smell of a place that doesn't register human trouble. She'd spent summers at Lac Brûlé as a girl. Her father Gus had leased a camp on the North Shore when she was young, and they'd driven this same road every June, with the car packed too full and the canoe strapped to the roof. He'd taught her to read the water for where the walleye would hold in the early morning cold. He'd taught her to portage without putting the canoe down. He'd taught her to sit still in a boat for 4 hours and understand that patience and waiting are not the same thing. "You're not watching for the fish," he used to tell her, both of them drifting in the gray before sunrise. "You're watching for the moment when everything gets quiet in exactly the right way. When you feel that, the fish is already coming. You just have to not scare it off." She'd been 9, and she'd thought he was talking about fishing. Philippe had found it charming when they were dating, this woman who could paddle a loaded canoe through a headwind and navigate by the stars if she had to. Later, he found it unnecessary. He never told her to stop talking about her father, about the lake, about the north. He just stopped listening, and a thing nobody listens to is a thing you eventually stop saying, until one day you realize you've gone quiet in ways that have nothing to do with the conversation. The road bent around a granite outcrop and the trees opened, and there was Lac Brûlé. If you've made it this far, take a moment to subscribe, because what Nora was about to find on the shore of that lake is the reason we wanted to tell this story in the first place. The lodge sat at the end of a gravel track that angled down toward the water, partly hidden by a stand of mature white pine that must have been 80 years old. It was a big building for what it was. 2 stories of squared timber gone silver gray with weathering, a stone chimney on the south end that was still plumb, a covered porch running the full length of the front, and behind it down a short slope to the water's edge. The boathouse she'd seen in the assessor's photographs. The photographs had not been generous. In person, the building was worse. 2 windows on the upper floor were boarded. The porch decking had collapsed in sections, as the steps up to the front door were held together more by habit than by the remaining wood. Moss had claimed the north wall up to the roofline, and the gutters had given up in the second-to-last section, and now hung at an angle that was almost philosophical. The assessor had not been wrong, and yet the chimney stood, and the roof, for all its dented tin, didn't show daylight from the driveway. And when Nora finally stepped out of the Subaru and crossed the dead grass to the porch, carefully testing each board before she trusted it, the air down by the water smelled exactly the way it had smelled the last summer she'd been happy. She'd come here to sell a place she'd been a child near. She hadn't expected it to recognize her. The front door was padlocked. The keys in the envelope from the lawyer's office were 3. A small brass one that fit the padlock, a newer one she didn't recognize, and an old iron one that looked older than the building itself. The padlock opened on the first try, as if it had been expecting her. The interior smell came out to meet her. Dust and cold ash and something resinous. Pine boards that had been holding heat and losing it for decades. Her eyes adjusted to the dimness. The main floor was a single long room that ran lodge width. The north half a gathering space with a stone fireplace and timber mantel. The south half a dining area with a long plank table and mismatched chairs. A kitchen ran off the back. A staircase on the east wall led up to what she assumed were sleeping rooms. The walls were pine-paneled and hung with topographic maps and a mounted northern pike that had been there long enough to look like it belonged. 3 oil lanterns sat on the mantel, clean and filled. On a peg by the door hung a fishing vest, old canvas, faded to the color of a birch trunk in February. A patch on the shoulder read Lac Brûlé Fishing Guide Association, the thread worn to near nothing at the edges. Nora crossed the room and pressed her face into it before she knew she was going to. It still smelled like her father. Lake water and wood smoke and that specific cold air smell that only lives at latitude. She stood there a long time with her face in her dead father's vest, and she did not cry, because she'd done her crying in the guest room of a friend's house in October, while the walls were thin, and she'd tried to be quiet about it, and that well had run dry. On the dining table were his enamel thermos and a tin cup and a block of cedar half carved into the shape of a loon that would never be finished. He'd been working on it the week he died. The body was smooth, the neck roughed in, the bill still raw wood waiting for a knife that wasn't coming back. Nora set it down. She looked at the room she'd inherited and the practical part of her. The part that had been managing things quietly for 22 years while Philippe managed everything loudly. Began making calculations. Call a lodge broker. List the land with a hunting outfitter or a resort company. The building was a liability. Take whatever they offered and put the north behind her like everything else. That was the plan when she walked through the door. It lasted until the light changed, and by then she'd already decided to stay the night. Stay with us here, because what Nora did next, almost without deciding, is the moment the whole story turns. She told herself it was the drive back in the dark on that road, and there was truth in it. But the truer thing was that she wasn't ready to stop smelling the vest. So she found wood stacked in a covered lean-to off the kitchen, dry and split and plentiful, enough for a month, and she built a fire in the stone fireplace the way her father had taught her. Birch bark at the base, dry cedar for kindling, split maple on top once the flame took. She opened the damper all the way until the draw established, and then closed it back to half. The stones of the fireplace began ticking as they warmed. One of the oil lanterns had a full reservoir. She lit it, adjusted the wick and set it on the windowsill where the glass faced the lake, and the flame doubled itself in the dark water beyond and threw a warm circle over the long room. Night on Lac Brûlé was a thing she'd forgotten too. No orange glow on the southern horizon, no sound of traffic, no neighbors. Just the ice beginning to crack on the shallows as the temperature fell, and the pines working in whatever wind was moving off the lake, and a darkness outside so complete it. Pressed against the glass, like something alive. Nora made tea on the wood stove in the kitchen because that was what you did when you didn't know what else to do. She sat at the long table in the lantern light. In the lodge her father had left her, with $11,000 and a cracked windshield to her name. And for the first time in longer than she could honestly measure, nobody in the world knew exactly where she was. The thought should have frightened her. Instead, it felt like finally putting down a weight she'd been carrying so long she'd forgotten it was there. She slept upstairs in a room with a rope-sprung iron bed and a mattress that was better than it had any right to be, under 2 wool blankets that smelled of cedar and old summers. She woke in the night to a sound outside she couldn't identify and lay still, listening. Footsteps on gravel, the creak of something, a gate or a shed door, and then silence. She came down the stairs with the fireplace poker in one hand and her phone in the other, and she put her eye to the gap at the edge of a wind where the frost on the glass had cleared. There was a young woman in the driveway, early 20s, maybe, in a winter coat too light for the temperature, with the careful stillness of someone who had learned that the best way to not be noticed was to not move. She was standing at the edge of the tree line, looking at the lantern in the window of the lodge, and the expression on her face, visible even at that distance, was not trespassing. It was recognition. Nora opened the front door. The cold came in like a hand. "Who are you?" she said. The young woman didn't run. She looked at the lantern and then at Nora. "I didn't know anyone was here," she said. "The light was on. That's why I'm asking." The young woman's jaw worked. "I have a key," she said. "I have the old key. Gus gave it to me." She held it up. The iron key, the one that matched the door. Her name was Petra Masson, and she was 24 years old, and it took her the better part of 2 days to give Nora even that much. That first morning she wouldn't come inside. She stood on the porch, the goods section, near the door, and answered in short sentences, her eyes moving from the lantern to the tree line to the road the way a person moves who has learned that knowing the exit is the first thing you do in any space. So Nora made tea and carried 2 cups outside, and they sat on the cold porch step and looked at the lake, which was steaming faintly in the November cold, and did not talk much, which turned out to be the only way Petra Masson knew how to be near another person. "You knew my father," Nora said. "He let me work," Petra said after a pause. "I was 17. I'd left. A situation. He found me sleeping in the boathouse and he didn't call anyone. He handed me a broom and said the dock needed cleaning and the south rooms needed the mattresses turned. He didn't ask me anything." Nora watched the girl's profile. "Where did you come from?" "Ruin mostly, foster before that. 7 different houses by the time I was 16. She said it the way you'd read out a postal code. Flat, no weight allowed near it. When I was old enough to leave I did, and I had nowhere particular to go. And I walked north because I'd heard the fishing camps hired in the summer. And you found this one." "There was a light in the window," Petra said. She looked at the porch boards. "All the way from the road a mile off, up through the pines. You could see it even in the rain, so I came toward it." She shrugged, a small motion. "I thought it was a trap. Nobody leaves a light on for someone they don't know. But I was cold enough that it didn't matter what I thought." Nora filed that away, without comment, the way she was learning to do with this girl, because pressing at it would have sent her back into the tree line. But it stayed with her. A light in the window. She'd set that lantern without thinking, the same windowsill, the same place. She hadn't known she was repeating anything. If you're still with us, this is where it stops being a story about a fishing lodge and becomes something else entirely. Subscribe now, because the reason Gus Veilleux kept that light burning is the reason none of what follows can be undone. She couldn't bring herself to call the broker. That was the truth she arrived at over the following 4 days. alone in the lodge with a girl who appeared at the tree line each morning and vanished into it each evening. Every time Nora got as far as taking measurements or pricing a phone call, she noticed something. The careful way the firewood was stacked. More than one man living alone ever needed. The second and third sets of dishes in the kitchen, mismatched but clean. The 4 cots she found folded and stored in the cedar closet off the back hall. The 3 pairs of work boots lined up in the mudroom in sizes that were not her father's. The lodge kept telling her things she didn't have words for yet. So she stopped trying to sell it and started doing what she'd always done when things fell apart, which was to fix something with her hands. She resurfaced the worst of the porch boards, with lumber she found stacked under a tarp behind the boathouse, pulling nails and cutting boards by hand, with a saw from the tool chest in the basement. She remortared a section of chimney stone that had gone loose and rained grit into the fireplace when the wind was right. She drained the pipes that had been left to chance before the first hard freeze, and relit the boiler that served the kitchen, and stood in the kitchen the first morning. It ran with hot water and felt something she hadn't felt in a year, which was competent. Philippe had spent 22 years, making her feel like a woman who checked before she did things. Up here, there was no one to check with. There was only the next board, the next job, the next problem the lodge presented, with the patience of a building that had been waiting for someone to pay attention. Petra worked alongside her more each day, though never quite with her, always at a slight remove, the way a dog that's been startled enough times keeps itself one step further from reach than friendliness requires. She was good with her hands, better in some ways than Nora. She knew the lodge's quirks the way you know a place you've wintered in. That board over the threshold, she said, the first time Nora stepped across it with an armload of cedar planks. Gus never fixed it. He said it told him when someone was coming in. They recalked the upstairs windows on a cold afternoon, Nora mixing compound and Petra pressing it into the frames with a precision that came from somewhere beyond training. And somewhere in that cold afternoon, without being asked, the girl began to talk. Not about herself, about Gus. He'd go out on the dock at first light every morning, Petra said, working compound into a corner. No matter the weather, he'd just stand there for 10-15 minutes looking at the lake. I asked him once what he was watching for. She smoothed the compound flat with her thumb. He said he was listening for the day's first problem. Said if you could hear it before you saw it, you had a head start. What else? Nora said, because she wanted the coins to keep coming. He taught me to read ice. How to tell from the color and the sound whether it would hold. How to paddle into a headwind without fighting it. How to set a line in current. Petra pressed her palm flat against the sealed window frame. He never once asked me what had happened before. The whole 3 summers I worked here. He just acted like the before part didn't count for anything and the right now part was what mattered. She was quiet a moment. You don't know what that does to a person, she said, until somebody finally doesn't treat you like your worst thing happened to you. Nora handed her the next section of compound and did not ask either. And that was the kindness. And Petra seemed to feel it, because she didn't go back to the tree line that evening. She stayed for supper. The days took on a shape. Nora woke before light in the iron frame bed upstairs, and came down to build the fire back from the banked coals, kneeling on the stone hearth and blowing until the orange caught. She made coffee in a dented percolator on the wood stove and carried it to the front porch to watch the lake come up gray, and then pale gold as the light moved across it. The well pump still worked, and the water it brought up was cold and faintly mineral, and tasted the way water should taste. Each morning that had the feeling of something earned. One evening, Petra did a thing she hadn't done before. She came up the porch steps while Nora was sitting with her second cup gone cold, and stood there a moment looking at the lake. Have you been up the dock tower? She said. The what? The fish observation tower. Petra nodded toward the boathouse. Gus built it off the back corner. You can see the whole lake from the top. The shoals, the channels, the spring spawning flats. She paused. He said most people never climb a thing they own. So Nora set down her cup and followed her, around the side of the boathouse and up a steep wooden staircase that clung to the outside of the back wall. 20 feet of cold-treated lumber bolted to the structure, that opened onto a small platform enclosed by a waist-high railing, with a view that stopped the air in her throat. 42 acres below, and beyond it Lac Brûlé all the way to the northern shore. Black water steaming in the cold, and the pines pressing in on every side under a sky the color of pewter, with one break in the clouds to the west where the sun was going down in a narrow stripe of amber. Under her feet the boathouse creaked in the wind, and there, tacked to the railing post with a thumbtack that had been there long enough to rust, a child's drawing on yellowed paper, a lake and a dock and two figures, one tall and one small, with a fish between them on a line. In the bottom corner, in the labored capitals of a child learning letters, Nora and Papa, lac brûlé. She had no memory of drawing it. She must have been 7, maybe 8. He had kept it up here, pinned to the railing of a tower on a lake in the Abitibi for 40 years. She didn't say anything. She didn't trust her voice. Below, through the boathouse window, she could see the lantern she'd left on the windowsill of the lodge, the only light in a mile of black water and darker pine. He never lit it for himself, Petra said beside her. The lantern. He had a headlamp if he needed to move around at night. The lantern was always in the window, always faced the lake road. She was quiet a moment. I asked him once why when there wasn't anyone coming. What did he say? Nora asked. Petra got it right before she spoke. He said you don't light it for the night someone comes. He said you light it for all the other nights, so it's already burning on the one night it matters. Neither of them spoke after that. They came down the staircase in the dark without talking. Nora banked the fire and Petra went upstairs to the room she'd been given at the end of the hall, and that night, for the first time since she'd arrived, she didn't drag her duffel bag in front of the door. It was a small thing. It was the largest thing Nora had seen in a year. It was on the 11th day, pulling a warped section of floorboard in the dining room to get at a pipe fitting underneath, that she found it. She'd levered up the damaged boards with a flat bar, and when she swept the subfloor underneath to check the joists, her broom caught on something. Not a seam from age. A deliberate edge, straight and clean, running square around the perimeter of a section of decking that was cut to lift rather than nailed through. Nora knelt and ran her fingers along the edge the way she'd been running her fingers along everything in this building all week. Learning it the way you learn a language you already know, somewhere below conscious memory. The blade of her pocket knife fit into the seam. She pried, and the section came up clean and dry, and beneath it a cavity between the floor joists, sealed from moisture by a sheet of copper flashing that had been there long enough to turn green. Cold, still air rose out of it, paper and metal and cedar shavings, the smell of something deliberately kept. Inside were 4 composition notebooks, the old kind, black and white marbled covers, rubber banded in pairs. A metal lockbox, olive green, the hardware store kind. A flat tin, the type that held tobacco years ago, sealed with electrician's tape and heavier than it should have been. Nora lifted the top notebook with both hands. The cover was soft and worn, the spiral binding crimped from years of opening. When she turned it back, the first page was in her father's handwriting, the same hand she'd seen on the dock registration slips, and the grocery lists pinned to the kitchen bulletin board for 20 years of childhood summers. Small and even, slanting slightly downhill the way his writing always had. June 14th, 1981. She read the first entry in the gray window light, and then she sat down on the subfloor with her back against the wall, because her legs had made a decision without consulting her. If you've stayed with Nora this far, take 1 second to subscribe and tell us in the comments where you're watching from, because what was written in those notebooks is the thing that turns this whole lake into something no one in the region will forget. June 14th, 1981. A man named Thibault came up the road on foot tonight, worked the mine in Licorne, lost the job last month, walked further than he meant to. Gave him supper. He talked for 2 hours about his father, who he says nobody else will listen to stories about. Sent him home in the morning with a full thermos and enough gas for the drive. Told him the lantern stays lit if he needs the road again. Nora turned the page. The lantern stays lit. The next entry was 2 weeks later. A different name. A trapper's wife and her daughter 3 days from town. A bruise she was explaining as a door. Given the upstairs room. Gas money and a name in Rouen in the morning. A cousin of a cousin who would not ask questions. The entry after that, a boy of 16, 2 nights out of a home in Val d'Or, fed and given a bed and driven by Gus himself the next morning to the one social worker in the district he trusted to be gentle. Page after page after page. Names and dates and reasons, and at the end of nearly every one, the same line in some form or another. The lantern stays lit. The doors open. Told them to come back if they need. Nora began reading them aloud after a while, because it felt wrong to let words that quiet exist in silence a second time. Petra came in from the porch, heard her voice through the door and stood in the entryway without taking off her coat. when Nora reached an entry with no name, only initials, P in the words. Didn't ask me anything, first time in 3 years. Petra turned and went quietly back to the porch. Nora let her go and didn't follow. She understood now what the lodge had been trying to tell her all week: the extra sets of dishes, the 4 cots, the firewood stacked for more than one person. The lantern faced always toward the lake road. For nearly 40 years, her father had kept a light burning on this shore, so that anyone walking the worst road of their life would have somewhere to walk toward. He had fed people and listened to them and recorded each one, not as a debt, not as charity, but as a life. A name and a date and a reason, and the note that the door was still open, and he had never told a single person, not the community, not the church, not his own daughter, who had spent every summer of her childhood 30 feet from a trapdoor she never knew was there. She opened the lockbox. Inside, $160 in mixed bills worn soft, a key she didn't recognize, a folded receipt dated 1983 from a hardware store in Rouyn-Noranda, 4 wool blankets and 2 sets of work clothes, sizes varied, that her father had kept for 40 years for reasons she would never need explained. Then she peeled the electrician's tape from the flat tin, and the tin was full of letters, 53 of them. She counted twice because the number mattered in a way she couldn't explain. 53 letters in 53 different hands. Notebook paper, church bulletins, the back of a hydro bill, one on the inside of a flattened cardboard box, all addressed in one way or another to the man at the lodge on Lac Brûlé. A woman named Odette who wrote that she'd come up the lake road in 1992, intending not to come back down, and that the light in the window was the only reason her grandchildren existed. A man named Kowalski who wrote that the $200 Gus had pressed into his coat pocket in a bad October got his family through the month, and that he'd passed it on 3 times over since. A boy, the handwriting still learning itself, who wrote only, "You didn't ask me anything and I have thought about it every single day since." Letter after letter. A quiet record of a region's worst nights and the one door that had never been locked. Petra came back in when the light was failing. Nora had lit the lantern without thinking and put it in the window. They sat at the long table with the notebooks open between them. "He wrote me down," Petra said. It wasn't a question. Nora found the page. She turned the notebook so Petra could see it but didn't read it aloud, because some things a person needs to read in their own time and at their own pace. Petra looked at the entry for a long time without speaking. "I read it before," she said finally. "Once. When I was alone up here." She set her hand flat on the page. "I keep knowing it's there." Nora understood that. The one piece of evidence that you were ever worth the trouble. 2 pages from the end of the 4th notebook, she found her own name. Nora called this evening. The entry read, dated 14 months before he died. She sounds far away in a way that has nothing to do with distance. That husband of hers does all the talking, even when he's not on the phone. You can hear him in the spaces where she used to say what she thought. She says everything's fine in her polite voice, the one she started using around 25, when she figured out fine was easier. I didn't push, never could push her when she got quiet and set like her mother. I wish she'd come up to the lake. I wish she'd sit on the dock in the morning the way she used to and remember she was someone before she was someone's wife. But she won't come, maybe. The lantern's in the window. It's always been in the window for everyone else who needed it. I keep it lit for mine too, just in case. Come up, Nora. The door is open. It always has been. He had written her name in a book of strangers and kept a light on for 14 months she never knew about. Della closed the notebook. Nora closed it and held it against her chest, and the well that had run dry in October turned out to have only been waiting for the right reason. She was not going to sell this place. She'd known it for days. Now she knew why. She came down into town 2 days later for supplies, and that was how the community found out that Gus Veilleux's daughter had come back to the lodge. The town at the bottom of the lake road was called Sainte Mathilde des Pins, 1,400 people and a main street with a dépanneur, a hardware, a caisse populaire, and a diner that had been run by the same family since 1962. Nora had bought penny candy there as a child. The woman behind the diner counter, broad-shouldered and gray-haired and quick, the kind of quick that belongs to someone who's been reading rooms for 50 years, looked at her for a long, still moment when she walked in. "You're Gus's," she said. It carried to the corners of the room. The diner turned around. What happened next was something Nora had no preparation for. 22 years with Philippe had made her a woman people were civil to, and these people were not being civil. They were doing something older than that, They came to her table one and two at a time. A man with a logger's hands held both of hers. "Kowalski," he said, "your father put $200 in my coat pocket in October of '97 and told me to buy my kids winter boots. I paid it back in the spring and he wouldn't take it. Said pass it to the next fellow." He held her hands a beat past what courtesy required. "I've passed it to the next fellow 11 times now." "He never told me," Nora said. "He never told anyone," Kowalski said. "That was the whole of him. That's how you knew it was real." A woman named Odette sat down across from her and didn't say much, because some things are too large to fit through the mouth. A retired police officer named Tremblay leaned against the end of the booth with his hat on the table. "More than once over the years," he said, "I'd get a call from the lodge. Your father's voice, same time. No matter someone, I've got someone up here who needs a ride to town, Tremblay. Come without the lights on." And I always did, because when Gus Veilleux called and asked you to come without the lights on, you understood something important was being handed across, and you didn't need to know more than that. It went on like that for nearly an hour. The diner turning itself into a quiet accounting of 40 years' worth of what her father had put into the community without ever letting the community know it was happening. The man who ran the hardware there refused her money for the caulking and the weather stripping both. He carried my account through a winter in '89, he said, and never once mentioned it afterward. "So you'll take the supplies and let me settle something that should have been settled 30 years ago." By the time Nora drove back up the lake road with 2 weeks of supplies and a propane tank that Kowalski had quietly arranged to have filled and delivered, she understood. She hadn't inherited 42 acres and a set of crumbling buildings. She'd inherited a lantern and the long list of everyone it had ever been lit for, and a reason to keep it burning. She found Petra splitting wood in the yard when she got back. She made up the second upstairs room properly, the one with the better mattress and the window that faced south, the one she suspected her father had kept made up for exactly this kind of arrival. And she told Petra the room was hers for as long as she needed it, using almost exactly her father's words without knowing she was using them. The girl went very still, and then she nodded once and went back to the wood. That was the whole conversation. It was enough. The silver SUV came up the lake road 17 days later. Nora heard it before she saw it. An engine with the smooth, slightly smug note of a vehicle that cost more than the lodge and its contents combined, taking the gravel track with the effortless confidence of a machine built for roads that were beneath it. She came out onto the porch and watched a white Escalade pull into the yard and stop square in front of the steps, and a man get out who had no business on a lake road in November, and carried himself in a way that made the fact irrelevant. 50s, trim, good coat, boots that were clean, smile that had long ago become a professional tool he deployed the way a contractor deploys a level. "Bryce LaChapelle," he said, "Northern Corridor Properties. You're Gus's daughter." He said it the way you'd say a thing you'd already known before you drove 4 hours to confirm. "Nora Veilleux," she said, "this is my property. What can I do for you?" The hand he'd extended came back without ceremony. He turned a slow circle, taking in the lake, the tree line, the sight lines, a man doing arithmetic. "I made your father a fair offer on this parcel 3 times in the last 9 years, he said. "Generous, given the assessed value. He turned me down each time and never gave me a reason I could work with." A pause calibrated to land as sympathy. "I was sorry to hear about his passing. I'd hate to see his decision cost you the kind of money you could use right now." Nora said nothing. She'd been learning silence from this lake all week, and she understood now that most men can't leave it lying on the table between them. LaChapelle couldn't. "Let me be plain," he said. "This is the only deep-water parcel with road access in a 40-kilometer radius. I have crown land under option on 3 sides of you. My architects have a boutique lodge designed. 12 cabins, a main lodge, fly-in fishing packages, the whole offering, and every rendering of it requires this shoreline. Your 42 acres are what makes the project viable. Without the Veilleux parcel, I have an investment in optioned crown land and nothing to sell around it." He said a number then. 40,000. He watched her face. When her face didn't give him anything, he said another. 90,000. For $830 of assessed land and a building the county had written off. "You could restart entirely," he said. "I understand you're between things." That phrase, "between things," had been Philippe's exact phrase in the mediator's office, the gentle diminishment of it, the way it made the last 22 years sound like a pause instead of a life. Nora felt the old reflex move in her, The 22-year habit of smoothing, accommodating, making the man in the room comfortable so the moment would pass. And then she felt the lantern behind her in the window, and the 53 letters in the tin, and her father's handwriting on the last page. The door is open. It always has been. The reflex died where it stood. The property isn't for sale, she said. It wasn't for sale when he was alive, and it isn't now. You've had a long drive for a short answer. This is where Bryce LaChapelle stopped smiling and made the mistake that cost him the lake. Subscribe now, because what Gus Veilleux did decades before he died is about to reach out of the past and end this conversation before it really starts. LaChapelle studied her for a moment with new flatness in his eyes, a man rereading a situation he thought he'd already understood. "That's your call," he said, the warmth gone like heat from a stovepipe left open. "But here's the thing your father didn't have to contend with. That structure has no current occupancy permit. The dock hasn't been safety inspected in 12 years. And my surveyor has a question about the eastern boundary and whether the survey your father registered in 1978 lines up with the current cadastral mapping." He set a card on the porch railing. "My legal team can make this property difficult and expensive to hold. Code enforcement, boundary disputes, liability on an uninspected dock. It takes time and money you may not have to spend." He said it without heat, the way a contractor quotes a job. "Or you take 90,000 and a clean beginning. People in your situation tend to do the math." He got back in the Escalade. "They always do," he said through the window, and back down the track with the careful, unhurried precision of a man who was certain he'd be back. Nora stood on the porch a long time after the sound faded. Petra had come up behind her somewhere in the last 5 minutes, quiet as weather. "He sent a surveyor up twice while Gus was alive," Petra said. "Your father made him a coffee and walked him off the property in the same conversation." Nora looked at the business card. "I don't have a lawyer," she said. "I don't have money for a boundary dispute, and I don't know what I have." She didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the iron-frame bed and listened to the lake and thought about the names in the notebooks. The people who had faced worse than this with far less, and about the man who had quietly made sure they didn't face it alone. She lit the lantern before she came downstairs. She put it in the window where it belonged, and she decided that whatever else happened, the light was staying on. The answer came up the lake road the following afternoon. Nora was at the long table going through the third notebook when she heard a vehicle on the track. Older than LaChapelle's, slower, with the particular engine sound of something that had been well maintained for 20 years and expected to go 20 more. A dark green Jeep came into the yard and parked at a respectful distance from the lodge, and a woman got out, late 60s, maybe 70, straight-backed in a plaid coat, reading glasses on a cord around her neck, and a leather briefcase that had the worn look of a thing carried into a great many serious rooms. She stood by the Jeep for a moment and looked at the lodge and the boathouse and the lake the way you look at a place you've only ever heard described. Then she came to the porch steps and stopped. "You'd be Nora," she said. "I'm Vivienne Arsenault-Cote. I practiced environmental and property law in Rouen for 30 years before I retired. I came because Roland Tremblay told me Gus Veilleux's daughter was up at the lodge, and because a man in a white Escalade has been asking questions at the cadastral office about your eastern boundary, and the two of those things together got me out of a warm chair I'd been looking forward to for some time." She looked at the lantern in the window. Something moved in her face. "May I come in?" Nora made coffee. They sat at the long table, and Vivienne Arsenault-Cote set her hand flat on the old pine and said quietly that she had sat at this table exactly once 20 years ago. Nora waited. "My nephew," the woman said. "My brother's boy. He was 21 and he was in a very bad way, and he drove up here one night because a man at the truck stop in La Sarre told him there was someone at the lake who would sit with you and not call anyone you didn't want called." She turned her glasses over in her hands. "Gus kept him for 5 days. Walked the lake with him, fed him. Didn't tell my brother, didn't tell me. Just kept the light on until the boy could keep himself going." She put her glasses back on. "He's 49 now. He lives in Gatineau with his wife and 2 daughters, and he teaches high school English, which your father would have found deeply satisfying." She looked at Nora over the frames. "So when I tell you I'm going to handle the man in the white Escalade, I want you to understand I have been waiting 28 years for a reason to do exactly that." Nora showed her everything. She lifted the section of floor and brought out the 4 notebooks, the lock box, the tin of 53 letters. The old lawyer went quiet. She read 2 of the letters and had to stop. Then she got businesslike, because that was how Vivienne Arsenault-Coté held herself together. The occupancy permit, she said, going through Lachapelle's threats one at a time and taking the air out of each. He cannot condemn your home to acquire your view. The municipality hasn't cited you. He's betting the word violation frightens you into selling. So we take the word away from him. We'll have a licensed inspector through before the end of the week, and a lodge maintained by a man who ran it for 40 years without incident is not a hazard. She tapped the table. The dock is the same. A formal inspection and a maintenance record makes that threat disappear. She looked at Nora over her glasses. The boundary question is more interesting. What do you know about a key that's not this building? Nora set the unfamiliar key on the table. The one from the lockbox, newer than everything else, was labeled in her father's hand with a symbol she hadn't decoded. 3 letters, RFT. Vivienne looked at it for a moment. Then she said very carefully, "Did your father ever say anything about the Réserve Foncière des Terres? The land reserve?" She set her coffee down. "Did he ever mention speaking to anyone from the Provincial Crown Lands Office?" Nora started to say no, and then she stopped, because she remembered. A summer afternoon when she was a teenager, sitting on the dock watching her father in conversation with 2 people in green provincial vests with clipboards, both of them very serious, Gus shaking hands with one of them saying something about a designation being permanent, and her father saying, in a tone she'd filed away without understanding, "Good, then it's settled and it stays settled." She told Vivienne. The green vests, the clipboards, the word permanent. Vivienne Arsenault-Coté set down her coffee with the deliberate care of someone managing themselves carefully. "Green vests," she said. "Clipboards." She stood up. "Get your coat, we're going to the registry office." Because what they found in the Rue Noranda registry office is the turn of this entire story. Stay with us, because it explains why a man with $90,000 never had a chance against a man who'd been gone for over a year. It took a day and a half and a registry clerk named Bernard who had known Gus and treated the request like a personal obligation, but they found it. Volume 312, Folio 44, registered 26 years before Gus died, a formal agreement under the Provincial Ecological Integrity Program, under which Gus Auguste Veilleux had placed the entirety of the Lac Brûlé parcel, all 42 acres, including the shore frontage and the boathouse lot, under a permanent conservation designation in partnership with the Provincial Crown Land Authority. The land could not be subdivided. It could not host commercial development. It could support the existing structure and all traditional uses, fishing, guiding, seasonal accommodation, in perpetuity. The designation ran with the title. It could not be purchased away. It could not be negotiated around. 26 years ago, without telling a single person, her father had given away for nothing the exact thing Bryce Lachapelle had driven 4 hours to buy. Nora looked at the page for a long time. "But Lachapelle made an offer," she said. "He has lawyers." "Wouldn't a title search have turned this up?" Vivienne smiled, and it was not a warm smile. "A title search would find this in an afternoon. He's known about this designation longer than you have." She folded her hands on the registry office table. "He wasn't counting on buying protected land. He was counting on you not knowing what you had. Broke, recently divorced, alone, no legal support. He comes up with a number big enough to feel like rescue and hopes you don't know enough to say no." She looked at Nora. And once he had the title, he was going to approach the Crown Land Authority with an offer to amend the designation. Trade them something elsewhere. Write a check the program couldn't refuse. It happens. But he was wrong, Nora said slowly. On every count, Vivienne said. Because you know exactly what you have now. And provincial conservation designations under the Ecological Integrity Program don't get amended for a boutique fishing lodge. The ministry would not survive the politics of it. She turned the page in the registry folio. You want to know who sits on the Regional Ecological Integrity Advisory Board? She said a name. Odette. The woman from the diner who hadn't been able to find words. Who had come up the lake road in 1992. Who had driven toward a light in a window. The second key, the one labeled RFT, opened a file cabinet in the Crown Lands field office in Rouen, where her father had kept a copy of the signed designation agreement, and, clipped to the inside cover, a note in his downhill hand, for Nora, when the time comes, she'll understand what this was for. Vivienne drove her the hour and 20 minutes to Rouen herself, because she said a thing like this shouldn't be read alone in an unfamiliar room. The field officer who met them was professional and quiet, and shook Nora's hand with both of hers. "We had contact from a development company in the spring," the officer said twice. "They proposed a land exchange, a larger parcel north of Sanitary, more public benefit, they said. I let them finish both times. Then I told them the same thing, that the man who set this designation up drove my father to the hospital in a whiteout in 2001, and wouldn't let him thank him for it, and that there is no parcel in the province that buys back what this lake is." She looked at Nora. They stopped calling. Beneath the agreement in the file cabinet, Nora found a second envelope she hadn't expected, thin, her name on it in her father's writing. She didn't open it there. She read it that night in the upstairs room by the lantern alone. What was in it she told no one, except that afterward she folded it along its original creases and tucked it into the front cover of a new notebook she'd already decided she was going to start. Where she could find it. The way Petra kept knowing where her entry was. Bryce LaChapelle came back up the lake road 10 days later, and this time he didn't get out of the Escalade. Vivienne Arsenault-Cote walked off the porch to meet him in her plaid coat with a manila envelope in hand. Nora watched from the porch steps while the old lawyers spoke through the window. She couldn't hear what was said. She didn't need to. She watched LaChapelle take the envelope, take out the first page of the designation agreement, and read it with the particular stillness of a man discovering that the problem is much older and much more permanent than he'd been prepared for. She watched him say something. She watched Vivienne answer with the unhurried ease of a woman who had been waiting 28 years and had no reason to rush. The window went up. The white Escalade backed down the lake road for the last time, careful now on the gravel, and she never saw it again. He'd come for a shoreline and found a locked door. The same locked door her father had been leaving open for everyone else for 40 years. "There's a justice that doesn't require a courtroom," Vivienne said, coming up the porch steps. "Your father built it 26 years ago and never told a soul." She looked at the lake and the trees and the lantern already lit in the window against the coming dark. He didn't do it to stop anyone. He did it so this would still be here when someone needed it, long after he was gone. She handed Nora the envelope. "It's yours now, the land and the reason for it. The rest is up to you. If you've made it all the way here, you're exactly the kind of person these stories are meant for. Subscribe and stay for these last few minutes, because what Nora did next is the whole point of everything that came before. The community found out the way communities always do, slowly and then all at once. Vivienne, who turned out to be constitutionally unable to keep a good thing quiet the way Gus had, told one person about the notebooks and the tin of letters. And that person told another, and by February the story of the lantern on Lac Brûlé had traveled the length of the region. People started coming up the lake road, not in trouble this time, to bring things. Kowalski left 2 cords of mixed hardwood stacked in the lean-to without a word. Odette came up on a Sunday with a quilt and a pot of soup and stayed for 3 hours, and told a story about Nora's father that made Nora laugh in a way that surprised her with its own force, as if the laugh had been waiting in a room she'd forgotten she had. Tremblay came on his day off with his tools and helped Petra rebuild the lower section of the dock, and stayed for supper. "You're good at this," Nora told Petra one morning, watching her show a young man who'd come up with his father how to pack a portage canoe without losing stability and current. "At what?" Petra said. "Teaching. I'm just showing him how the weight wants to sit," Petra said, and looked uncomfortable, and Nora let it go, because she'd learned that you let people find the truth of themselves on their own schedule, and when they get there, you put the kettle on, and Nora stayed. She'd come up the lake road with $11,000 and a plan to be gone by noon. Somewhere between the floor cavity and the registry office, she'd stopped looking for the way out, the way Petra had finally stopped positioning herself all nearest the door. She took shifts at the Dépanneur in Sainte Mathilde 2 days a week to cover the propane. She learned to run the lake radio channel on summer mornings, reading the weather and the water conditions to anyone who might be out. She started walking the shore each evening, first because it was useful, and then because it was hers. And every night, first thing, before anything else, she filled the oil lantern and trimmed the wick and set it in the window that faced the lake road, so that anyone coming up through the pines in the dark, on the worst night they'd had in a long time would have. The way Odette had. The way Petra had. The way she herself had without knowing it, somewhere to walk toward. She started a 5th notebook. She didn't tell anyone. She simply took a new composition book from the hardware in Sainte Mathilde, the old marbled kind, as close as she could find to her father's, and tucked his last letter inside the front cover and set it on the long table. She didn't wait long. It was a night in early March, wet snow coming sideways off the lake, when headlights she didn't recognize crawled up the lake road and stopped in the yard. A woman got out, 40, maybe, in a coat not warm enough, with a teenage boy behind her who hung back the way children hang back when they've seen too many wrong decisions made by adults and have started doing the math themselves. The woman looked at the lodge, at the smoke from the chimney, at the lantern in the window, then at Nora in the doorway, and she had the expression Nora had seen on other faces that week and worn for 22 years in her own mirror. Someone carrying more than she had words for. "I saw the light," the woman said. "I'm sorry, I didn't think anyone would be up here." "I can keep going." "You can't keep going," Nora said. "It's coming down too hard and that boy's cold." She stepped back and held the door open. "Come in out of it. There's a fire and there's soup on the stove. There's a room upstairs." The woman didn't move for a moment. "Why?" she said. It was the same question. The same question 53 letters had asked in 53 different hands. Nora smiled. "My father used to get asked that a lot," she said. "Come inside." She fed them. She warmed them. She made up the south room and did not ask the woman a single question she didn't want to answer. In the morning, after the snow had eased and the woman had gone on toward a sister in Timmins, with a full tank of gas and $60 pressed into her coat pocket, Nora sat at the long table and opened the new notebook. She wrote in a hand that slanted slightly downhill the way her father's always had, the date and a name and a few sentences about why the road had brought this one here tonight, and at the end, the only line that mattered. "The lantern stays lit. The door is open. Come back if you need." Petra read it over her shoulder, something she would not have done 4 months ago, and was quiet a while. "He'd have liked that," she said. "He'd have liked that you stayed," Nora said. The girl went still the way she did, and then she nodded and went out to start the morning's work, and Nora watched her from the window. A young woman in a coat that finally fit, working in the yard of a lake property that could never be taken apart, under a conservation designation placed there by a man who had known 26 years ago that the best way to protect a thing is to make sure it means too much to too many people for money to ever move it. Maybe that's the part of this we miss most. We spend so much of our lives measuring the things that show up on paper. The house, the pension, the assessed value, the settlement terms. We let the people who measure that way tell us what we're worth, and we believe them because they have the folders and the tabs and the clean offices and the ways of making loss sound administrative. But the things that actually hold a place together, the things that make a community show up at a diner to return 30 years of quiet kindness, none of that shows up on an assessor's card. Gus Veilleux fed people in the dark for 40 years and wrote each one down not as a charity case, not as a story, but as a life. He never asked to be thanked. He never told anyone. And in the end, the quiet thing he'd been doing in the North Woods for 4 decades was the one thing on that whole lake that no amount of money could buy. Because he had made it mean too much to too many people for money to move it. Bryce LaChapelle had $90,000 and a folder full of renderings, and he lost to a man who'd been dead for over a year, because he never understood that the most valuable thing a person can leave behind is the good they did for someone who had no way to pay it back. That was Gus Veilleux's real inheritance. Not the 42 acres, not the lodge the county valued at nothing. He left his daughter a lantern, and the long quiet record of every soul it had ever guided through the dark, and the simplest instruction you can give to someone you love: keep the light burning. Don't make a fuss about it. Just keep it burning. A legacy, it turns out, isn't what you leave behind. It's whether the people you leave it to understand what it was for. So if there's a light you've been meaning to put in a window for someone, some small thing you keep telling yourself doesn't count because nobody's watching, put it there anyway. Put it there for all the nights nobody comes, because you will almost never know which night was the one that mattered. And to the person walking up the dark road toward it, it will mean more than you could ever add up. Nora Veilleux was 53 years old. She had $11,000 she hadn't needed to spend after all, a part-time job at a dépanneur, a young woman in the room at the end of the hall, who had finally started sleeping through the night, and a lake that could never be taken. She had a tin of 53 letters and counting, and a new notebook with 2 entries in it, and a lantern in the window throwing its small steady light out across the water. On clear evenings, when the ice had gone and the lake lay still, and the loons were back on the far shore, she would climb the tower off the boathouse and sit on the observation platform where her father had stood every morning for 40 years, listening for the day's first problem. She'd watched the light go gold and then copper and then gone behind the western tree line. And below, in the window of the lodge, the lantern she had lit would come up warm and steady as the dark came on. One point of yellow on the whole black face of the lake, small and certain and burning for whoever needed it next. The road came to her door, and the door was not locked. It never had been, and Nora Veilleux, who had arrived with a cracked windshield and a plan to leave by morning, sat on her father's platform above her father's light and understood at last that she was not at the end of anything at all. She was just getting started,